In 632 CE, in the city of Medina, the Prophet Muhammad died. For the early Muslim community, his passing triggered a profound psychological shock. The direct link to heavenly revelation was extinguished. The community faced a central epistemological challenge. How does a religion survive the loss of its living source of authority? Beyond administrative logistics, they had to determine how divine law would be interpreted without the prophet present to mediate it. The shock was so severe that some prominent companions initially denied the prophet's death entirely. Abu Bakr, a close confidant, stepped forward to restore clarity. He declared to the gathering, "Whoever worshipped Muhammad, then Muhammad is dead. But whoever worships Allah, then Allah is alive and never dies." This statement reaffirmed the prophet's mortality and anchored the community back to the eternal nature of the divine. To understand the theological landscape that formed in the wake of this moment, we have to look past the modern definitions of Sunni and Shia. During the prophet's lifetime, these terms did not exist as mutually exclusive, divinely ordained religious categories. Centuries of retroactive theology have obscured the original events. By examining the 7th century socio-political crises that forced the codification of Islamic orthodoxy, we can see exactly how a singular religious movement split into distinct paths. This table compares the competing models of Sunni and Shia origin, evolution, and leadership focus. From the exact same historical starting point, the death of the prophet, a unified religious community developed two incompatible frameworks for preserving divine truth. As early political fractures deepened into permanent divides, prominent scholars like al-Ash'ari and al-Maturidi worked to synthesize and codify what became the dominant Sunni theology. They built a system designed to defend scriptural text against rising sectarian factions. The resulting divide centers on the exact mechanism of post-prophetic authority. The debate asks a specific question: is the truth preserved horizontally, through the collective consensus of the community, or vertically, through a divinely appointed lineage? In classical theology, the term Sunni is an abbreviation for al-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the people of the prophetic tradition and the community. It requires strict adherence to the behavioral precedents set by the prophet, combined with the collective consensus of the early Muslims. A core pillar of this framework is the rejection of bid'ah, or theological innovation. In the Sunni model, every core doctrine requires an explicit scriptural mandate. Without textual proof from the Quran or the prophet's verified actions, a new theological claim is rejected. The term Shi'at Ali has a distinct linguistic root. In 7th century Arabic, the word Shia translated to party, faction, or partisans. To be Shi'at Ali meant you belonged to the political faction supporting Ali ibn Abi Talib. During the First Civil War, the Muslim community polarized into opposing camps. Because the concept of separating religion and state did not exist in this era, political allegiance naturally carried religious undertones. However, identifying with a faction did not signify a unique set of theological doctrines or alternative jurisprudence. Shia apologetics argue that the prophet intentionally divided his community, explicitly ordaining a specific party of Ali to safeguard the faith. Classical Sunni scholarship rebuts this by pointing to the prophet's repeated warnings against sectarian fragmentation. They cite the famous Hadith of the 73 sects, where the prophet predicts division as a tragedy to be avoided, stating that the only saved group is the one adhering to the path of himself and his collective companions. Prominent classical scholars, including Ibn Taymiyyah, emphasize that this saved sect is defined strictly by methodology. It is not tied to a secret lineage, a specific tribal allegiance, or an isolated political party. Consequently, the orthodox Sunni position concludes that any group retroactively claiming to be a divinely ordained faction, separate from the consensus of the early companions, engages in blamable innovation. While the prophet's family prepared his body for burial, an immediate political vacuum threatened the state. The Ansar convened an emergency gathering under a palm frond portico known as the Saqifah. They intended to elect a leader from their own ranks, fearing marginalization. Abu Bakr and Omar hurried to the Saqifah to prevent the fragmentation of the state. A crucial debate ensued. The Ansar argued for their right to govern based on their military sacrifices. Abu Bakr countered with a pragmatic reality. The disparate tribes of the Arabian Peninsula would only submit to the leadership of the Quraysh, the Prophet's own tribe, due to their established socio-political prestige. The crisis was resolved through shura, or consultation. Umar stepped forward and pledged allegiance to Abu Bakr. The others present followed suit. This formed a binding communal consensus, known as ijma, establishing Abu Bakr as the first caliph. The Shia historical narrative views the events at the Saqifah as an illegitimate usurpation. They assert that Ali possessed a divine right to rule, explicitly ordained by the Prophet earlier that year at a location called Ghadir Khumm. To address this, Sunni historians contextualize the events leading up to Ghadir Khumm. Ali had recently returned from a military expedition in Yemen, where he had strictly enforced the distribution of war spoils. This severity generated notable resentment and complaints among a contingent of his own soldiers. This diagram breaks down the Arabic word Mawla. Depending on context, it translates to friend, patron, ally, or beloved. Linguistic scholars point out that if the Prophet intended to appoint a head of state, he possessed unambiguous political terminology to do so. Therefore, the Sunni framework interprets this sermon as a robust defense of Ali's spiritual stature against his critics, not a decree of political succession. A second major point of contention is the Calamity of Thursday. 4 days before his death, the Prophet asked for a pen and paper to dictate a document. Umar intervened, stating the Quran was sufficient. Shia tradition claims Umar deliberately prevented a written decree naming Ali as successor. Classical Sunni scholars like Ibn Hajar analyze this differently. They explain Umar's intervention as an act of profound compassion, acting out of concern for the Prophet's severe physical agony during his final hours. The Prophet lived for 4 more days and never requested the writing materials again. The orthodox deduction is clear. If writing that document was a strict divine mandate establishing the core pillar of leadership, the Prophet would not have abandoned it over a minor disagreement. Leadership, therefore, remained a human, administrative necessity. At the very center of Sunni epistemology sits the doctrine of udul al-sahaba, the collective probity of the companions. This doctrine does not suggest the companions were infallible or immune to sin. They were human beings who made political miscalculations and engaged in personal disputes. But as a collective generation, they are universally regarded as legally and religiously trustworthy. This network graph represents the verification process for hadith transmission chains, known as isnad. The traditions passed down by the companions were verified and distilled into the 6 major canonical collections of Sunni Islam. Shia polemics assert that the vast majority of these companions apostatized to deprive Ali of his succession, rendering the Sunni hadith corpus contaminated. Sunni theology refutes this mass apostasy claim by referencing explicit Quranic verses, such as Surah Al-Fat, which permanently declare God's satisfaction with the believers who pledged allegiance to the Prophet. The epistemological stakes here are absolute. The companions were the exclusive channels through which the Quran was compiled and the Hadith preserved. Logically, casting doubt on their collective righteousness destroys the mechanism for preserving the religion itself. The contrasting architectures become clear. Sunni Islam engineered a system reliant on horizontal community verification. It rejects the structural fragility of tying the preservation of the truth to a single, vertical, infallible bloodline. The theoretical debates over succession eventually met the harsh reality of governance. By 656 CE, the initial unity of the state fractured under the weight of rapid imperial expansion, culminating in the assassination of the 3rd Caliph, Uthman, by political dissidents. This sparked the first fitna, or civil war. When Ali was elected as the 4th Caliph, his administration was immediately consumed by demands for justice against Uthman's assassins. This led to a military stalemate at the Battle of Siffin between Ali and Muawiyah, the governor of Syria. The political impasse at Siffin resulted in an agreement for human arbitration. This decision outraged a faction of Ali's own army. Taking an extreme literalist reading of the Quran, they seceded, becoming the Khawarij, the first violent puritanical sect in Islam. In 661 CE, an assassin from this very group murdered Ali. In this image of a Karbala reenactment, the red and green colors reflect a trauma etched into the cultural memory of the region. Hussein, the son of Ali, was intercepted and massacred here in 680 CE by Umayyad forces. Karbala shifted Shi'ism into a theological identity defined by martyrdom, moving the movement beyond its origins as a political faction and into a movement centered on divine grievance. Because Sunni history acknowledges the reign of the Umayyad Empire, a common polemical claim asserts that Sunni theology indirectly excuses the massacre of Hussein in the name of political stability. The orthodox Sunni position refutes this entirely. Classical scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Kathir universally condemn the Umayyad ruler Yazid, stating unequivocally that Hussein was unjustly martyred and expressing profound grief for the atrocities committed against the Prophet's family. But there is a strict theological boundary. Sunni Islam treats Karbala as a severe historical disaster and a political tragedy. It does not treat the event as a metaphysical turning point that would justify altering established religious rites. Emphasizing the prophetic mandate of sabr, or patience in the face of calamity, mainstream Sunnism strictly forbids ritual self-flagellation and the institutional cursing of historical figures. The theology remains intact, untouched by the political violence. Sunni scholars responded to the early civil wars by building an intellectual structure based on rigorous textual preservation. They moved from immediate political survival to codifying a faith based on an unbroken textual record. The Sunni framework is an epistemological engine engineered for collective endurance. By anchoring authority in the consensus of the early community rather than the divine right of a bloodline, it ensured that the preservation of the religion relied on the shared continuity of the text itself.